Transgression is a term used to describe an act categorised as deviant that goes against the law or societal norms and values. For example, an individual robbing a bank would be committing a transgressive act, but also would a person having an affair on their partner. Ultimately, acts of transgression are any wrongdoings which violate the morals ingrained in society. The art form of transgressive cinema became central in mainstream cinema in the 1960s when films began to truly push boundaries and intend to shock viewers in efforts to reflect current social anxieties. Nick Zedd, an American experimental filmmaker and the founder of the Cinema of Transgression movement, created a manifesto entitled The Cinema of Transgression in 1985, where he coined the term to describe the underground film scene based in New York, which consisted of a loose-knit group of artists who had shared an aim of breaking boundaries through the art of film using humour and shock value. Zedd wrote, "It has to be threatening the status quo by doing something surprising, going beyond all limits set or prescribed by taste, morality, or any other traditional value system shackling the minds of men." This movement continues to grow and heavily influence filmmakers today. Most, if not all, genres of film contain a certain element of transgression with the purpose to excite and even humour the audience. Violence in film is used to entertain rather than shock audiences. This can even be seen in kids' cartoons such as Tom and Jerry. Mainstream film genres where transgression is the main element include horror, slasher films, for example, Alfred Hitchcock's iconic work of Psycho, gangster films, western, and war. As an audience, we have become increasingly desensitized to images of violence and gore that have been projected to us through cinema and other sources of the media. As a result of this, transgressive cinema has continued to grow increasingly popular in mainstream film in efforts to keep viewers interested and excited. This brings me to the heavily debated relationship between on-screen violence and the violence which occurs in society. Do transgressive films encourage real transgressive acts? There are many examples of crimes that have evidently been inspired or triggered by transgressive films. However, I've decided to focus on two films which have caused some sort of outrage, but both receiving different responses and attitudes from each other. The films I've chosen are The Dark Knight Rises and Blue Story. In July 2012, a 24-year-old man named James Holmes claimed that he was the Joker when he proceeded to engage in a shooting at a midnight screening of The Dark Knight Rises in Colorado, United States. The massacre resulted in the death of 12 people and dozens of others were wounded. The Christopher Nolan film was the final installment of the Batman trilogy and did not actually include the Joker's character. Heath Ledger won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor when playing the Joker in the previous Batman film in 2008. However, Ledger was never able to accept his award due to his tragic death during the editing of the film.
I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you? Go back to ripping off mob dealers? No, you complete me.
The attack by Holmes was planned to mirror multiple scenes from the Batman comic book series by Frank Miller in 1986. The series featured a character named Arnold Crimp who had just lost his job and went on to kill 3 people in an adult cinema. This was the first similarity Holmes intended to make. He set off smoke bombs in the theatre in order to copy a scene from the comic where the Joker murders a television audience using smile gas. He also trapped his apartment with tripwire at the front door that would have set off explosives as another way of commemorating the Joker. James Holmes was arrested and sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences in which he pleaded guilty to by the reason of insanity. As the massacre was evidently inspired and motivated by the Batman film, what did this mean for the movie? There were subsequently no major consequences for the film, as both Warner Brothers and theatres did not announce any plans to stop showing the film, which was currently doing huge business at the domestic box office. The only real change was to increase the audience's safety when viewing the film. This included more security, smaller bags being checked, and no costumes permitted. From this case study, I can conclude that although the transgressive nature of The Dark Knight Rises motivated an individual to conduct a violent act, The film was not affected or blamed for the massacre committed by James Holmes. To contrast, Blue Story, a British crime drama about the dangerous consequences of gang warfare and knife crime, produced by the BBC, was banned in cinemas across the UK and Ireland after significant incidents had taken place at the first few screenings of the film. Blue Story, directed by rapper Rapman, is centred around a postcode battle between two gangs in South London and how it can divide the bonds between friends. It also features a rap interlude by Rapman, which enables the audience to reflect on the difficult situations that the characters have to go through.
But one thing that mummy didn't know was the area we lived in where she wanted me to go. The day was in the postcode war and it was peak, but mummy didn't know about the streets.
The film was banned by the View and Showcase cinema chains in order to ensure safety of customers and prevent further violence from taking place. A headline from the Sun newspaper reads, "Axed from cinemas after 100 thugs armed with machetes and knives crashed its opening evening on Friday, November 22nd. 25 incidents of some degree were claimed to have been recorded in 16 separate cinemas during the first 24 hours of screening, and 7 police officers were injured." The treatment surrounding this film caused controversy, as other films which have incited violence were not blamed for the incidents that had taken place and were allowed to move forward as usual. In comparison to Dark Knight Rises, Blue Story's message is educational, and its aim is not to glamorise violence but to show the harsh realities of street culture and the strain it can place on relationships. The story is intended to mirror the current lives of black working class youths that are disadvantaged through societal racism and poverty.
And I just thinking, oh my gosh, what's the reason? And then you start thinking, is there hidden reasons there? What's the owner like? Has he got an issue with young urban youth? Is he prejudiced? Does he believe that this film brings a certain type? Is there a colour thing? So you start thinking of all these things, and then, oh no, man, it was an upsetting time.
Blue Story becoming banned meant that audiences could not become educated on the real-life matters that the film was discussing. This made me wonder if perhaps Blue Story was about white mainstream culture and had a larger budget, would the treatment have been the same? Arguably, a transgressive act of a bigger scale occurred at the Dark Knight Rises screening. However, the film had no consequences compared to Blue Story. Silencing Blue Story undervalues the film's context and shows society's ignorance to black culture. Institutional racism, a term first coined by Carmichael and Hamilton in 1967, identifies a much more covert racism which is embedded in society systems such as employment, education, and in this context, the film industry. This is just one example of how black people are systemically discriminated and snubbed by white privilege. People of colour make up only 3% of the UK's film workforce, despite being 17% of the UK's population. So, to conclude, does violence in film officially create violence off-screen? When watching violent films, we go through a process of detachment, which allows us to understand that the violence occurring is not happening in reality and the people involved are just acting. However, not everyone is able to detach themselves easily, which makes viewing transgressive cinema problematic. Although the more we are exposed to violence in film, the more we become desensitised to it. This does not mean that we would all be motivated to engage in violent acts, as we would still react appropriately to violence happening right in front of us. Films of a transgressive nature and other transgressive art forms should not be treated as the primary culprit for other people's actions. Cinema encourages us to feel emotion, however it does not cause violence. The blame for that entirely lies with the individual.